Hello and welcome to this, the first episode of Landlord Voice, a new podcast from the Scottish Association of Landlords. My name is Alan Grant, and I'm joined by SAL's Chief Executive Officer and all-round housing expert, John Blackwood. Today, and in the episodes which follow, John and I will be looking at the issues that matter to Scottish landlords, interviewing the politicians who make housing policy in Scotland, and discussing the state and future of the sector, all with the goal of empowering Scotland's private rented sector in mind. So John, welcome to Landlord Voice. Episode 1. Let's hope it's all uphill from here.
Thanks, Alan. And yes, we're delighted to be able to get this podcast up and running and get it out there so that Scotland's private rented sector could have a voice, and allows us to be able to bring that voice of Scotland's landlords together and discuss the issues of the day.
Indeed, these are interesting times, particularly politically, for Scotland's private rented sector. And you sat down with one of Scotland's most influential politicians, Housing Minister Paul McLennan, at SAL's Scottish Letting Day conference recently to discuss with him a range of topics. How better to start off this podcast than talking about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity for us to be able to really focus on the politics of the day, and what a better way to do that than obviously discuss what the Housing Minister's been saying about the private rented sector. I have to say he's always been keen to meet with us and to discuss with members as well too, our issues and our concerns, and it's really important that as the voice of landlords that we're able to take that direct to the politicians and the Minister of the day.
Indeed. Now, we'll be playing that full conversation shortly, but before we do, can you give me your view of the context around it? You said a little bit there, but I'd like to expand on that point slightly. In particular, the difference between before and after the breakdown of the coalition that the SNP had with the Scottish Green Party, and what has that meant for landlords?
I think it's always important to remember, and always say this, that politicians are out there chasing votes. That's their job. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to win elections, essentially. And landlords don't win votes for politicians, regardless of the political party. But what's important for us is that we focus our intention on who is in power at the time and the ministers in charge. And really, we've been doing that from day one. So we've always engaged very well with the government of the day, and with all politicians from different parties, to get our opinions across, to make sure we're representing landlords and letting agents the best way we possibly can. And I think it's fair to say that there was very much a change in the attitude that the government had towards us after they went into a cooperation agreement with the Scottish Greens. So when the SNP and the Scottish Greens came together, it was remarkable the difference that certainly we witnessed in the private rented sector with regards to their view of the sector, how they wanted to engage with the sector, and how they saw the future of private renting in Scotland. So I'm pleased that we've moved on from the days of the cooperation agreement. The SNP now is very firmly still upholding a lot of the principles that they had when they were in that agreement with the Scottish Greens. But I think we've got a much more productive dialogue with the government now than we did before, and I'm very keen to build upon that and make sure we end up with a better private rented sector.
So there's clearly been quite a bit of churn and political activity and almost chaos within Scottish politics. In your dealings with the Scottish government, with ministers, with politicians, has there been a new sort of sense of calmness possibly? Has things kind of steadied, would you say?
I think it's always difficult to kind of analyse, and it's very easy for us to retrospectively look at conversations we've had and what might well happen in the future. There's certainly been a change in tone, which is good. The Minister, as I've said, is always keen to meet with us. We've had many meetings and discussions, and he's been keen to discuss the issues of the day with our members as well too. So certainly they're more open to hearing what we've got to say. And although they have an agenda, and they're very firmly fixed, of course, on supporting tenants and making sure that in Scotland tenants have the best deal that they possibly can, but equally now they're starting to say, yeah, but we're listening to landlords, we're listening to private sector investors. We need to ensure that we encourage them to continue to stay and operate within the sector. So that there's a mood change, but words are just words at the end of the day. We need to see actions. And that's what we're hoping for, perhaps through the passage of this housing bill, where the government will be able to turn around and say, yeah, we do want to support the sector and this is how we're going to do it. We're not quite seeing that yet, but I hope that will come in time.
That's very encouraging. And obviously this is the first episode of Landlord Voice. It is a bumper episode because we're going to present the full conversation that John had with the Minister later on in the show. But before we get to that, now the big takeaway that we saw, certainly as far as the media was concerned from your conversation with Paul McLennan, was that he confirmed, contrary to what other politicians have perhaps hinted to or said directly, that he does consider landlords to be, quote, working people. Have you, since he said this and he's confirmed this belief, have you seen any evidence for it since this meeting? And if so, what form has that taken?
Well, as people will hear when they listen to the conversation, and indeed if they were at the conference, the focus was very much on, do you value us as private landlords and letting agents? What is the government's honest opinion of us operating within the sector? Do you want us? And the clear message that was coming across is, yes, they do want the private rented sector. They feel that it does need to continue to operate. And individual operators, private landlords, are still very much an important part of the housing mix in Scotland. So there was positive messages coming through there. I did ask about the working people because, of course, the UK government were unwilling to confirm whether they thought private landlords were working people. The Minister was very clear to say that, yes, private landlords are working people. But he also said that actually landlords need to get a return on their investment. Now, that was a key takeaway for me from that conversation, because he was keen to get that message across. It's not just about covering your cost. Landlords are investors. You need to see a return on that investment. So I think that was something certainly I wasn't expecting in the day, but that was a good outcome for whatever you can take from that.
Yeah, it definitely signals as you said, a mood change and a sort of an attitude change, a sort of professionalism change, and that must be very encouraging. But I wonder if we can perhaps build on that. How do we see that translating into say policy and a kind of an approach to measures that perhaps the Scottish government could quash or could implement that you would like to see?
Well, you have to remember when we had the conversation, that was just when the bill had been laid before Parliament. So it was very early days of the discussions that all politicians were having in the Scottish Parliament about the future of the private rented sector, but also importantly about rent control and how rent control was going to operate in Scotland. So we had yet to really have some of the detailed conversations about what rent control would look like. So in principle in the bill, it was there. They were saying it's going to happen. We're still committed to bringing this in. But how it's going to work in operation, we're still a wee bit unsure about. So since then, and of course we were very clear in saying that rent control stymies investment, actually turns investors off. They will go and invest somewhere else. It makes investors nervous, thinking, actually, will I still be able to make a return on this investment in the future? And of course, for many of our members, they were saying, it's not just about a return, we need to cover our costs, because we've come through a horrendous time with the cost of living crisis, where all costs have gone up. And of course, that's affected our tenants, and we need to support our tenants the best way we can. But it affects landlords too. Their mortgages have gone up. Their costs, the costs from tradespeople, the costs from regulators, all of that goes up. So somebody's going to pay for that. And that's where the consumers come in. And ultimately, tenants pay that through rents. So for landlords that hadn't raised rents for such a long time, they were saying, well, actually, if I'm not able to raise rents in the future, I might not be able to cover my costs. So that's a pretty frightening position for anybody operating in any sector. But in particular for private individual landlords. So that was a big concern. We've talked through some of those issues with the government. The bill's making its way through the Parliament as we speak, and amendments have been laid before the Parliament, and some of them we have been campaigning for and might well make rent control more palatable in the future.
So thanks, John. So we can now turn to what I'm sure most of our listeners clicked on this this bumper edition, this expanded edition, our debut edition of Landlord Voice to hear, and that is your conversation with the Minister. So here it is. This is SAL CEO John Blackwood in conversation with Scotland's Housing Minister Paul McLennan.
First of all, can I say a big welcome to Paul McLennan, MSP, who is the Minister for Housing within the Scottish Government. It's a delight to have you here, Paul. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. For landlords and letting agents throughout Scotland, I think it's understandable that many are very dismayed just now. They really feel that actually nobody's listening to their concerns, and they feel that for many, now is the time to sell up and exit the sector. And we know that that's starting to happen. What we need today is, I guess, a discussion around that, and what does that look like, and what will that mean for housing in Scotland. Of course, the climate is very different to what it was this time last year. We've had a change in government, I think it's been fair to say, and obviously the Greens are no longer working in cooperation with the SNP government. That has changed the dynamics in which we are operating. And I have to say, to be frank, we had a tenants' rights minister in the past who, quite frankly, was very anti-landlord and anti-private rented sector. Now, for me, representing landlords and agents, that's actually quite shocking that we have a Minister of State who, quite frankly, isn't interested in serving the whole of Scotland. So what I want to talk to you about today, Paul, is, has anything changed? Are we looking at a different government today with a different outlook and a different perspective on housing and the PRS to what we had last year? What's your vision for housing in the next 10 years?
John, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. And John's talked about opportunities to speak to yourselves within the group. I was up in Clackmannanshire a number of months ago and spoke to a group up there talking about that. I think for me, my background was, I was a councillor for 15 years and I was council leader in East Lothian. I was 20 years with the Bank of Scotland and worked in corporate and business banking as well. So try to understand where the sector comes from a business head on as well, but where the kind of, I suppose, the mix of housing is important. We need a multi-tenure approach to this in the PRS sector. We desperately need a PRS sector that's part of that. And I'll come out and quite clearly around about that. When I took over the Minister of Housing job in March 2023, I had my responsibility and Mr Harvey had his, including tenants' rights in the PRS sector. So the one key thing I said at the Housing Bill then was to make sure that we had the proper balance. So it's a balancing act when we come to this. So we mentioned about the rent controls and I made a statement a few weeks ago when we talked around about that. One, obviously we've got to protect tenants from high rent increases. And that can come from a number of reasons. It's all about supply and demand. It's around about some external things that have gone on as well. Cost of living, for example. We had the UK government come in and talk about local housing allowance, and that hasn't been changed either. So that impacts on that. So we need a thriving private rented sector. I have to give you policy clarity in terms of that. That's the most important thing. I have to make sure that you feel welcomed by the Scottish Government, and I want to tell you that today, that you're an important part of that. When we're talking around about, for example, around about rent controls, obviously there's an element of that, and I know we'll come on to this, John, in terms of there has to be a need demonstrated by the local authority on that, and I think that's incredibly important. There will be some parts of Scotland that don't have rent controls on them as well. So you and I meet on a regular basis. You're part of the Housing 2040 strategy group. So I have to give you the policy clarity. I have to give you the confidence that the Scottish Government values your commitment, which I'm giving you today, both from myself personally and from the Scottish Government. I think that's really important, that you feel loved, you feel welcomed. You are an incredibly important part of what we need to do. We're in a housing emergency for a number of reasons at the moment. The private rented sector is an incredibly important part to help us get out of that. You're business people as well, so you need to make sure you get living and you continue to do that without having the worries around where policy places you.
So about a year ago, we did a members survey, and of those landlords who said that they were considering selling up or even started selling up and leaving the sector, 83% of them said it was a result of landlord hostility and anti-landlord rhetoric from the government in itself. So how can you reassure everybody listening to this and watching this today that actually that has changed? Because it certainly has been anti-landlord. So is it any different now? How can you reassure us that that's the case, Minister?
I think obviously the Butte House Agreement was part of the discussions, and I'm aware of some of the thoughts and comments that have been passed on to me about the previous minister who had responsibility for that, from Mr. Harvey. And one of the key things I think we mentioned, John, at the time, I wanted to talk about a reset with the sector, and I think we're trying to demonstrate that as best we possibly can. I have a balance in terms of what we need to do around about rent controls, how we increase supply and demand, how we get investment into the sector is incredibly important, whether that's through yourselves, John, or whether it's through BTR, MMR, or MMR opportunities. How we work as closely as possible with local authorities, for example, in leasing schemes. So I think there's different ways we can try and do that. But, if you look over, when I came into post, I mentioned at the time we needed a thriving private rented sector, and I'll come out and say that now. We need a thriving private rented sector, and I welcome the contribution you make to Scotland's housing solutions. We need you more in the next number of months and years as we try and get out of the housing emergency in terms of that. My job is to give that policy clarity. That job is to maximise what work we need to do with local authorities, for example, and about leasing schemes. And as part of that, so you'll not hear me coming out and saying, I think everything I've said publicly around about the private renting sector has been very welcoming.
And with regards to that reset, the last time we spoke, you said the government needs to reset the relationship, just as you've mentioned, with the private rented sector. So what do you think you and your government has actually done so far to achieve that?
I think there's a number of reasons, number of opportunities. You and I have had a chat around about that. I mentioned about leasing schemes, for example. I think you've actually got a debate in the Parliament tonight talking about the Empty Homes Partnership. There's over 40,000 empty homes in Scotland for a various number of reasons. Some can be complex reasons. I think there are opportunities to try and work with local authorities about how we can combine what the work the Empty Homes Partnership is doing and empty homes, and where investment opportunities for yourselves can look at that. Person Kinross, for example, work very closely with the Empty Homes Partnership and have a leasing scheme that's in place. Now, I can't be doing that across other parts of Scotland. So the Empty Homes Partnership have been working with us, see how we can explore that. So that's one part of it. In terms of the rent controls, I think one of the key things was asking for clarity around about that. We looked at CPI plus at 1%. And one of the key things, I think, for that as well, the housing bill goes through its stage 1 debate next week. But we're doing a consultation, for example, on exemptions. In terms of that. But other things we talked about, John and I had a chat around about, I suppose, landlords at the moment that are charging less than the market rate. So how can we recognise that in terms of that? So John and I will have a discussion around about that. That will be part of the consultation. And I would encourage you as part of that consultation to come back and pick up some of these issues that we've got to do that, because it's all around about trying to achieve the balance. For me, when I looked at the housing bill previously in terms of where it was weighted, I needed to make sure that the comments that John's put forward, the comments from investors but also from renters as well, was trying to take forward and a housing bill that met all these targets. It's a very hard balance to achieve, but I'm here recognising what you've told me in terms of that, and John and I will continue further discussions. And as I said, when you're talking about the consultation, please respond to the consultation in terms of that, and let us look about what we can do in stage 2 amendments.
Now, you've always been keen, as you mentioned, to speak to me, and I have to say, the minister's been one of the most approachable ministers and since we started way back in 2001. And you've been keen to listen to our members as well too. And as I say, you've attended our online session in doing that. How do you think that has influenced your view of the housing bill and how that's going to be taken through Parliament? Have you listened enough? Has it made you change your perception of the private rented sector? Has it reshaped the bill in some way?
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things is because right the way through this, it's recognising that the housing bill was almost sitting above us all. And I think there was, what's the housing bill going to look like for landlords in terms of that? I think once we got to that position about what it started to look like, I think we can get into more deeper discussions around about that. And as I said, we talked around about, for example, landlords that charge less than the market rate just now. So how can we recognise that as part of the housing bill? And what can we take that as forward as part of any amendments can you going forward? So it's getting down to that level of detail in terms of trying to convince me how important the PRS sector was. I mean, I worked in a local authority where we used it in East Lothian, where we used the PRS sector as well, and they played a really important part in that. And the PRS sector in different parts of Scotland will play a different role. In Edinburgh here, the PRS sector is incredibly important. How do we work more closely, for example, about the number of empty homes? And Edinburgh has roughly around about 15% of the empty homes in Scotland. We have a PRS sector and investors who maybe want to get into that. How do we make sure we work closely with the local authority? How we work closely with the sector itself? And how do we make sure that you've got the policy clarity? If you're going to invest into that, you're going to get a return back. And that's almost a balance. So that's influenced, I think, where I'd like to see the housing bill, where we're going with the housing bill. Because I want to see the PRS sector grow. It's an incredibly important part. Some of the biggest issues we have at the moment in terms of homelessness and in the big cities, Edinburgh, in Glasgow, Fife has an issue as well, South Lanarkshire, and West Lothian are the 5 areas where most of the homelessness issues in Scotland are, not all of them, but around about 75%. So if we can work very closely with Edinburgh and Glasgow and the private rented sector, I think there's an opportunity to reduce that, but also give you investment opportunities and get people to come back into that. I need to give you the clarity through the rent controls, through other obviously measures that we're looking through in the housing bill. And it's not just the housing bill. In terms of that, what do we do beyond the housing bill in terms of that? So it's growing that sector. How do we get more people in? How do we make sure there's investment opportunities? It's there. So that's through the private rented sector in terms of individuals. If you have a portfolio of 15 or 20, how can we make you grow that to 25 or 30? But it's also speaking to institutional investors as well. So they play a part of that in MMR and BTR as well. So it's trying to get that balance right across and of course, putting more money into housing so we're building more homes. We've got a good record of building homes in Scotland at the moment, but we need to be doing more. Construction costs have gone up 35, 40% in the last 2 years, which makes it much more difficult. But the PRS sector plays a really important role in that.
So we've got landlords here today, many of whom will say, and whilst I welcome what you're saying, you're still not listening. You're not taking on board our concerns. How can landlords, through SAL or directly with their elected members, make their voice heard? What's your best tip to them to be able to make sure that their messages are getting across and the message of SAL is getting across?
I think there's a number of ways. I think obviously through yourself, when you and I meet on a regular basis, so we'll continue to do that. I mentioned about the consultation, about exemptions and what we need to do about some of the examples we talked about. It's taking part in that consultation either individually or through John. By all means, write to your local MSP in terms of that, or write to me. Just write Minister for Housing. Just look up the email address and write to me directly. We'll come back to you on these particular points. We've already, as I said, I think, taken part in online discussions, and I went up and visited landlords group up in Blackwood. So I took questions from the floor. But again, happy to consider these. Drop in, write me a note, and happy to do that. I need to get out and speak to people and listen to people. Through John, I think it's definitely influenced about where we'd like to go. But as I said, for me, it's not just about the bill, it's beyond the bill as well. But I need to give you that faith in what we're pushing in the bill will bring people back into the sector.
So do you think SAL has a voice to be able to represent those landlords and agents, many of whom are here? But how important is that to you as the Minister making these decisions, SAL's voice?
Absolutely, incredibly important. Because I think one of the key things is listening to stakeholders first and foremost. It is the most important part. Where does that take part in the housing bill, but going beyond that? And we have within the Housing 2040 strategy group, there's different, we have Homes for Scotland, for example, are included in that. Where does the PRS sector fit into that? And sometimes there's these connections I think are really important. So where does the PRS sector fit in with local authorities? I think there's more work that can be done with local authorities and the PRS sector working much more closer together. Where does government come in and trying to facilitate that as well? So these are things I'd like to see beyond the bill in terms of that as well, which I think are incredibly important. But we need the voice of SAL. It's represented nationally. It's represented here in the number of members that you've got here. But it's also listening to, and I think one of the key things as well is, I've tried to get around most local authorities in Scotland, and the position in every local authority is different. The role of PRS sector will be different at different and varying levels. But it doesn't matter what part of Scotland it is, the PRS sector needs to be an incredibly important part of that. So how do we make sure it's not just Edinburgh, Glasgow, the Highlands have a huge number of empty homes as well. So how can we work with Highlands in terms of that? So, so there's different ways we can try and tackle that. But we need to get through the housing bill and get to the other end that the private rented sector are happy with it. But continue that relationship because it needs to continue beyond that.
So moving on to the housing bill and that rent control issue, it'll be no surprise that, of course, we as an organisation and people listening to this, of course, won't support rent control. But we do appreciate you've got a balancing act here. You have to support those tenants in need, as well as hopefully those landlords as well too. So how can you, whilst we welcome the amendment that you proposed there, and that was, I think, as a result of what we were saying to you, that you were listening to us, that actually the potential, if a rent control area was created, that the rent could not go up at all, was unacceptable to us. Because as costs go up, rent should be able to go up as well too. A landlord's costs go up. So why are we singled out as a business community that can't raise our charges to our customers like the plumbers and the electricians can? That's just absurd. That doesn't make sense. So in the housing bill, you've said yes, even in a rent pressure zone area, that rent could go up. However, it would be capped at CPI +1 with a maximum cap of 6%. And that's certainly welcome to the sector. And I think that's the best bit of news we've had for some time. However, there's still this issue about in between tenancy increases. And we have many landlords, as I say here too, who don't increase rents. They haven't done it for years. They've got sitting tenants who've been there for a long time. They know their own personal financial circumstances. They don't want to make it difficult for them. They're happy with the rent that they've got or receive it from them. However, if they move on, it's actually perverse that you're actually planning to or proposing to punish those people for not increasing rents, because you're going to say to them, actually, you will never be able to get to the market rent. You'll never be able to increase your rents. So what can you say to reassure those types of landlords that that's something that could still be looked at? Can it still be looked at? Is there a mechanism for that to be changed, or is that set in stone?
No, I think, John, you'll remember that when we had the statement on rent controls, you were one of the key stakeholders that I phoned that particular night. And we talked about examples such that people who, set the market rate, set their rent at a lower rate than the market rent. And it's like, we look really happy to discuss that. And we'd welcome any discussions or proposals on that, and that's still saying that. And in that case, the other thing we obviously talked about as well was around about people investing into the property and how do we recognise that as well. So very open to proposals coming forward from yourself. We'll obviously have a discussion and look at that, because again, it comes back to me as to the balance around about, is making sure we have a thriving private and independent sector. And we don't want to punish people who want to invest in their property. So how do we recognise that? What's the mechanisms around about that? And I think I said at the time, we would welcome proposals from yourself and happy to discuss that, when these come in. So that's maybe something, and taking feedback from your members would be important, but it would be something we would consider. And I have the ability and the ability to look at that. So we're talking about exemptions. And I mentioned about the consultation process. The consultation process allows us to look at that in terms of that, and again, achieve the balance. Often when you get a bill coming forward at stage 1, it will change the time it gets to stage 2, where there's amendments discussed. And when it finally becomes law in stage 3, then you'll see a bill, well, very unlikely what it looks like at stage 1 will be what it's passed law at stage 3. So again, it's taking feedback from yourself. It's looking at proposals that we think you could work from your members, but where it could work from Scottish Government as well in terms of that. And as I said, it is about achieving that balance. It's making sure that rents stay at a certain rate, but it gives you the ability in terms of the examples you're given to look at proposals you could come forward with on that. So we welcome that as part of the...
So there is a potential for exemptions?
Well, I think in terms of bill, we talked about...
To protect those landlords?
Well, in terms of exemptions, or looking at how we could, without going into detail and without seeing any proposals, it's difficult to discuss. But in terms of proposals to recognise a rent that's maybe at a lower rate, and how do you recognise that if they're trying to go above the 6%, for example, or depending on where CPI is, or looking if somebody needs an investment into a property for various reasons. So it'd be good to go into that level of detail, but very much open to say, and it's not closing the door on that particular, these points that you've mentioned. Of course, like everything else, the devil's in the detail.
So we've been talking today at this conference about potentials for the sector to adapt, to change to different bits of legislation that's going to be introduced now and in the coming years. How can we encourage investment in the sector? What is your message to landlords and letting agents out there saying, do you know what? My business is in peril. I actually don't know if I will still be a landlord in 12 months' time, or whether I should still be operating within the sector. How can you encourage them to say that actually investing in property in Scotland is a good idea, and we still want you to be a landlord or a letting agent?
I think there's probably a number of reasons. One is the underlying sentiment in the message you get from government, and I'm very clear in saying that the private renting sector is an incredibly important part of housing, not just in terms of the housing emergency just now, but what we need to do going forward. I think the second part is obviously talking about policy and trying to give certainty on policy, not just on rent controls. It needs to be much more broader than that, because I think there's recognising about the rights of the landlords as well as tenants as well in this, and it's about achieving the balance. And it's all about you invest in your money. You need to get a return in terms of that. And it's maybe raising the points that John's talked around about, recognising some of the issues he talked about, John. For example, if there's market rates that have been set lower, there's been rents that have been set lower than market rates. And it's recognising the ability that's, in terms of, because we're also looking, for example, around about retrofitting. What do you need to do to bring your properties up to the proper standards in regards to that? But also in terms of just, if you've had a tenant for a period of time, you need to invest to bring that back up to standard. It's recognising that. That's where, having this discussion we've just had around about, okay, the part of the consultation, how do we recognise the variances that might happen during that period of time? I think we need all three to try and make sure that tenants want to come back into the sector. But it's about sentiment, about policy clarity, but it's about making sure and recognising, quite rightly, as a business, you need a return from that, and you're going to get that return. And that policy backs that up as well.
Well, certainly your predecessor didn't think there was a need for us to make the return, so nor did we have the right to make a return. So that's pleasing to hear that as well too.
And more broad, I suppose the other thing, in terms of, because the PRS sector is in it, recognising people who might have an individual property, recognising you've maybe got 10, 15, 20. We've also been speaking to the institutional investors. So last year I spoke to 25 institutional investors down in London. Continue to do that through the Scottish Property Federation about recognising that as well. So we're talking about opportunities, about build to rent and about mid-market rent as well. So it's trying to recognise that all tenure approach.
And thinking about that, what would your vision be if you've got that magic wand there and the political will there within your own party and of course within Parliament? How would you see the private rental sector changing in the next 10 years? Or what do you think it's going to look like? Will it still include people like us as individual landlords renting out one or two properties, or will that change?
No, I think it'll depend. And again, this comes back to the point I made around about each local authority. I think the private renting sector in each local authority will be slightly different in terms of that. What I'd like to see is we give you that policy clarity, so you don't need to worry about that. We're talking about, obviously, an opportunity around about making sure you get that return. So how flexible can the housing bill be to ensure that you get that whilst protecting the tenants that we're talking about? And it encourages investment from people like yourself or individual investors up until maybe a larger portfolio of 15 or 20. I want to see local authorities work much closer with the PRS sector as well. I think there's an element that the local authorities need to work a little bit closer and understand the opportunities around about that. There are some local authorities that are better than others, to be totally honest. In that particular point, so I would like to see local authorities work much closer with the PRS sector in terms of that. There are some, as I said, some leasing schemes that are out there, I think, and I would encourage the local authorities to do more with the PRS sector in terms of that. Now, whether that's formalised or not, if we're moving beyond the housing bill, that's where I'd like to see us to get to. There's a much closer opportunity, a much closer working relationship in terms of that. But very much see, as I said, want to grow the sector. The sector's incredibly important in terms of making sure we're making people have got a safe, secure home, but also giving you the return that you ultimately got into the business for, as well as providing homes.
We've had a change in the UK government. I'm sure you're aware of that as well. So that's happened very recently. And of course, they have their own issues with housing in England and Wales and a slightly different policy there. But landlords are essentially investors. And some are openly saying to me, yeah, I still would be interested in investing in property. But actually, I really don't know if I want to invest in Scotland. Would it not be better for me to invest in England because their legislation is perhaps, at least at the moment, a little bit more landlord friendly? What would you do to encourage them to invest in Scotland? Is Scotland still a place to invest in?
Very much so. I think we talked about before, one of the key things is obviously getting through the housing bill, stage 1 debate, as I said, it's next week, and trying to get to a point as we go through the stage 2 and amendment and so on, that we get to housing bill that the sector's happy with. And I recognise we need to get through to that point talked about the consultation and opportunities around about that. I think that's important. And I said my role as Housing Minister is to make sure we get that balance in terms of that, protecting tenants, protecting landlords, giving you the ability to get that return, and you're part of that mixed tenure opportunities. So I think we've moved in terms of the sentiment. I think I've tried to demonstrate that. I think we've moved in terms of the discussion points you made around about what the housing bill looks like. I think we've tried to recognise that also, and I think we mentioned around about the consultation and what we need to do, and look at some of the points that you might bring forward in terms of the consultation. So I want to see that. I want to see the private renting sector grow. I want to see institutional investment to come into Scotland as well. So that's whether it's built to rent or mid-market rent as well. We need to see that. It's a mixed tenure approach. So that's making sure we've got a thriving PRS sector. We're putting more finance into the housing sector as well. So it's building more social housing. It's making sure that the Homes for Scotland have their role in terms of that and building more private housing. But the PRS sector is an incredibly important part of that. So I think we've made progress. We have more to do as we get through the housing bill. And once we're beyond that, it's then trying to say how can we build the sector and make sure that we're working as closely as we possibly can with other stakeholders.
The Prime Minister recently got into some hot water when he was talking about the private rented sector, and he was asked the question, are landlords working people? That was the big question in England. How would you answer that here in Scotland? Are landlords working people?
Absolutely. And in my time as 15 years as a councillor, I met lots of landlords in that particular time. In my hometown, I know landlords that are there. Absolutely, of course they are. And everybody's here to make a living, whatever way people make a living. It will depend on their background and their own circumstances. Absolutely, they're working people in terms of that. And I've got to recognise that. And every single one of you either make your whole living out of this or part of your living out of this. I've got to recognise that as individuals. And I think that's a really important part. I have to give you that clarity. I have to give you that reassurance that it's valued by the Scottish Government. You're hearing that from me today. I need to get to the end of the housing bill and make sure you're going, right, okay, that's fair in terms of that. That's my job. That every stakeholder says, that's fair enough. Now, that's a difficult balancing act, as you can appreciate, but that's where I need to get to. But absolutely, working people.
Well, you've heard it here first. You are working people. Do you feel better from hearing that? So there you go. Minister, can I say thank you very much for taking time to join us today and share your thoughts. I know we're just at the beginning of this conversation. The proof is always in the pudding, and you have set out with an intention to reset the relationship with the PRS, and we're seeing signs of that through the amendments to the bill, for which we are grateful, and we look forward to have further discussion, shall we say, about further amendments and changes and regulations that would protect those changes between tenancies as well too. And I think everybody would say we want a private rented sector that works for everyone. That's important.
Absolutely.
It's important for tenants as well as it is important for landlords. Minister, thank you.
No, good pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was John Blackwood in conversation with Scotland's Housing Minister Paul McLennan. It sounded like a very friendly, productive, constructive chat that you had at conference, and I'm sure members really enjoyed hearing it. Have you heard anything from members about the conversation that they saw?
I think members are naturally and understandably very sceptical about what any minister is going to be saying with regards to the private rented sector at the moment, simply because they say, yeah, it's just words, and he's saying what we, or what at least he thinks we want to hear, but we need to see the actions, just as I was talking about earlier. So I think that's an important takeaway that he took from the conversation, is that yes, I'm telling you this, I can't tell you any more, in the sense of I want to encourage the sector to operate. I do value landlords. All of these messages came across, but they need to see support through legislation. So we need to see action from the government that is actually supporting landlords and saying, actually, we do want you, and here's actually how we're going to help you in your business. So I think there's been a shift from then to now, and that's what landlords are looking for. But we need to see more action, and that's still not happening at the moment.
Absolutely. Just on that point, since October when it was recorded, there's been quite a few shifts and changes on subjects like rent controls and various other measures, which obviously the minister couldn't comment on at the time. The policy was mid-development. So John, I wonder, could you sum up for our listeners what's happened since then for the PRS in Scotland? And if there is a renewed case for a little bit of optimism for the PRS.
Yeah, so basically the minister was making it clear both at the conference and all the way through is that they're still planning to introduce rent control. That's not going to change, despite everything we've been saying about it, that it deters investment, actually raises rents, and it reduces supply. So they're not good things within the housing sector. However, he's heard that, we have said it many times. But we've said also, if you're going to have rent control, we have to be able to raise rents in the future. It's one of these things that costs go up and therefore rents will go up. And okay, that could be in a controlled manner, but investors need to have reassurance as to how that's going to increase and that they'll be, at the very least, able to cover their cost. And as the minister says, it's not just about covering cost, it's seeing a return on your investment. So how can we build all of that into a structure of rent control? So there was a couple of issues that we've raised with the minister since then. One is, if we're going to have rent control, then it has to build in a mechanism that rents will increase in the future. Now, the way the bill is fashioned, and before amendments were laid, on the face of the bill, potentially rents could be capped at 0%, which means they would never, or at least within a 5-year period, be able to be increased. We said that's unreasonable. If rent controls are brought in, then there has to be a mechanism to raise rents. And the minister went away after a conference and various discussions and has introduced amendments to the bill to say that rents can increase. They would be controlled as to how they could increase, and that would be at CPI plus 1%. Now, that's a big win for us in the sector because it's a recognition of the fact that, yes, actually, rents do need to increase, albeit in a controlled fashion, and the 0% that's there in the bill is not acceptable. And the other aspect is looking at between tenancy rent control. So again, on the face of the bill, then that would be capped. And we said, but lots of landlords don't increase rents. We know that from our survey results. We know that other independent research backs that up too. If a landlord has a long-term tenant and has a good relationship with that tenant for a number of years, they tend not to increase the rent. And actually, perversely, they are being penalised for not increasing the rents, because it means that in the future, if rent control comes in the area where they're renting their property, they would never be able to increase it back to the market value. And there should be a mechanism to be able to allow that rent to be reset. And we're talking about here when a tenant who's been on a low rent for whatever reason for a number of years, when they move out, on the face of the bill it says when somebody else takes over that tenancy, they would benefit from that previous low rent that's been charged to the previous tenant. And we said that needs to be reset to the market, and not least because the landlord will have to spend money on that property to upgrade it, to bring it to the market. So these are the discussions we're having just now. There are amendments that have been proposed which cover that aspect, but equally as well, the government is, through consultation, which it has just published, is saying, yeah, okay, we're going to take that to the wider public and see what they think about it.
It's the relationship between the prices and costs and supply is well documented. You don't have to be an economics expert to know that these levers work in conjunction with one another, and one thing causes another. I wonder where the sort of the unwillingness to look at these kind of hard and fast facts of economics comes from. One wonders if it's from outside pressure. Is it an ideological thing? The unwillingness to look at this well-established economic framework. Where do you think that comes from?
I think it's an overall lack of understanding as to what rents are being charged in Scotland, and that's our number one issue. We said that actually before we think about introducing rent controls or look at the mechanism as to which that should operate, we need to understand what rents are actually being charged in Scotland, and nobody knows that. So it's all anecdotal information we have. We have some information about some market rents, but are they actually being charged? What is actual sitting tenants paying? What is the rent that's being charged to them? So we need to understand what rents are being charged in Scotland in order to understand what the problem is. We're trying to solve a problem without understanding the problem. And it's all because, of course, we do all hear the horror stories of rents going up, becoming more and more unaffordable for tenants. And an important message I always try and get across is that rents that are unaffordable to tenants is not a good thing for landlords, because that means at some point those tenants won't be able to afford to pay the rent. They'll get into arrears and the landlord won't get any money at all. So we need to have a system that's based on fact, it's based on evidence. And that's why we still say to this day, we need to have some sort of evidential base of what rents are being charged so we can understand what the problem is, what's the extent of that problem, and where does it exist in Scotland? Is this an issue for our big cities? Is this an issue in rural Scotland? We don't know, and we need to get those answers.
I'd just like to pick up on this information aspect of it, the fact that we don't know what levels of rent are effectively being charged in across the country. I wonder, I'm not putting you on the spot here, I promise, to come up with a hard, fast policy solution at the moment, but I wonder if you'd maybe talk about how that kind of almost a database, if you will, of information could come about. Is that something that the sector does? Is it something that Scottish Government leads on? Or is it perhaps even wider than that? Is it a partnership working between the different sectors of society to find out this information and so you can properly act on it? I just wonder if you talk a little bit.
Yeah, I think ultimately the government needs to take the lead. It needs to step up here and says we need to have a register. How we operate that is up to them. So there's been discussions, is that a variation of the landlord register? The government's not for that. They don't think it's really designed for that purpose. But we do need these facts. So it's for the government to go and work that out and determine how it's going to gather that information and, of course, publish it as well too. If we're going to have rent controls which are localised in local authority areas, they're going to need that data to make the case to Scottish ministers that they should become a rent control area. So that data underpins everything. It will underpin future policy and where we go with regards to investment. And why are rents going up in these areas? It's because there's greater demand than other areas. We need to understand that. And if we're going to be building new homes, does that allow us to focus our attention on where we build these new homes so that we do make sure that we've got enough affordable housing in Scotland?
It sounds to me as if there's a lack of joining up, perhaps within within the sector and the different groups that operate with it and Scottish Government. So would you want a more sort of collegiate, more linked up relationship?
Yeah, exactly. And the bottom line is we need to have a strategy here for the future. So the private rented sector, if they want us to continue to operate, and the government, the ministers you've just heard in the interview, is very keen to say that, yes, you're valuable to the housing mix, we need you to continue to operate. Okay, well, if that's the case, we need a vision, we need a plan, we need a strategy for the private rented sector, where I think the government needs to be honest with us and say, right, this is the size of the sector we see going forward. This is what we think we need. And these are the people we want to operate within it. So for a long time as individual private landlords, we feel we're being sidelined by the government, tolerated in some cases, but certainly not encouraged or supported. Now, is that because they don't want us? And I have said for a long time to officials and to politicians, if that is the case, just be honest with us. We're business people. You could just tell us, do you know what, we want you to exit the sector. They're saying, oh, no, that's not the case. And well, the evidence doesn't suggest that, and the political direction doesn't suggest that. So you need to work with us. So it's a case of the whole sector working together with politicians and other stakeholders, tenants groups as well too. It's important we all work together so that we can get a private rented sector that's fit for the future and serves everybody in Scotland. That's the landlords and the tenants alike.
Just turning back to your conversation with Minister McLennan, We heard a lot in that conversation about investment and about balance. We've heard, and you've just mentioned them just now, landlords who are nervous of the economic circumstances they're facing and of some policy direction. You cited rent controls. Are they right to be nervous? Are they right to be feeling cautious and but perhaps even considering bringing down the size of their investment in their portfolio? And if that is the case, what action can the Scottish Government in particular, and perhaps even local government, take to encourage more investment, get more houses on the market, and effectively bring down rents that way?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we see, it's basic economics that you were talking about earlier. Rents are going up because of the supply and demand issues. So there is a a huge demand for housing in Scotland to rent in the fibre rented sector, and there's fewer and fewer properties. So that in itself puts rents up. So that's basic economics, and we know that that's what happens when there's a lack of supply. So we do need to increase supply. That in itself will bring down rents. We know that that will happen. But the bigger underlying issue here is landlords are nervous. They're concerned about the future, and they're saying, "Do you know what? The direction of travel is not good for a private landlord in Scotland." Indeed, we're also having similar conversations and hearing similar messages from the Westminster government, the UK government as well too, which are equally not landlord friendly. So landlords are listening to that. They're getting nervous and they're saying, "Do you know what? I'm just going to sell up when I've got the opportunity." When a tenant moves out, they're saying, "I'm taking the opportunity to sell this property." And from our survey results, landlords are telling us that. That in a survey we did just at the back end of 2024, it was very clear that those landlords were saying we're starting to get rid of our rented properties, reduce our portfolios, with 53% saying that they want to sell. Some of them have started selling already, but that's certainly their intention over the next 5 and 10 years. So that's dramatic, and that's not just our research. Deposit Scotland's charitable trust did research recently as well too, and they found a very similar number of people wanting to exit the sector. So that should be worrying for any government, because that means a reduction in supply in the future of rented accommodation.
Is deeply concerning, and perhaps we heard the minister, and he has spoken previously of this, and he mentioned it again in his remarks to you. He spoke of a reset with the sector. In your observation since then, I'm going to ask you directly: has that reset happened?
I think it's beginning. So to be fair, he did say that. He also did say that, but you need to see action here. You need to see results, not just words. He did recognise that as well too. So from that, we have seen amendments to the bill introduced, which we were calling for, with regards to how rents could increase in the future. So yes, that's been an indication of a turning of the tide, shall we say, from the government to work more proactively with the private rented sector and value the sector. And the consultation that's going out or is out now is focusing on, well, what do people think about the prospect of landlords being able to increase their rents above that rent cap or be exempt from the rent cap. And again, that's something that we would encourage greater discussion on. So we're starting to see a different mood, shall we say, from the government. And that's important. So I think that's part of that reset. And certainly the very fact that he's prepared to engage with us, officials are talking to us, is very different as to how it was before. So yes, I think it's all indicative of a reset starting to happen.
So because I'm quite sure there are some of my fellow policy wonks listening to this podcast, or certainly will be once it's released. I'd like to turn to the housing bill, which is currently at stage 2 in Holyrood. That was also a key part of the conversation you had with the minister. Now, considering the minister's comments and events since October, can you give us your view on how the bill is as it is just now, and what it will mean to landlords as it makes its way through Parliament and beyond?
Well, I've already mentioned the amendments. So there's lots of amendments in there that we welcome, we've campaigned for. So I'm very grateful to the MSPs that have supported us. So we've had MSPs and the Scottish Conservatives who have supported us and introduced amendments that we've been asking for, and others in other parties as well too. So we've had the Lib Dems and some within the SNP and Labour supporting us as well too. So we're getting positive messages from many MSPs across the political divide who are seeing the fact that landlords are leaving. They don't like that. They want to prevent that from happening, but at the same time support tenants. And I'm saying that actually you can do both here. So a well-functioning sector serves both landlords and tenants. So we need to find a sector, a solution that supports the sector for the future and allows it to grow and develop. And that's what we should all be focusing on. So some of the amendments we certainly do welcome. There's others in there from other MSPs, which we would say are very anti-landlord. They want to take us back into rent control. They want to ban evictions, for instance. So we've got extremes within the amendments, as I say, many which we support and others that obviously we wouldn't. There's an awful lot of amendments directly affecting the private rented sector, which the Parliament's going to have to go through over the next few months. So that's going to take a lot of time, a lot of discussion, and a lot of lobbying on our behalf and others working towards a better private rented sector in Scotland.
Well, I mean, the housing bill is set to be one of the kind of central bits of legislation that goes through what is left of this parliamentary term. It's one of the main bits that's going to get an awful lot of focus put on it. Would you say you were more optimistic than you were previously about it, or do you still retain a skepticism that we're going to get at the end of this a housing bill that is fit for purpose?
I'm certainly more optimistic than I was 12 months ago and even before that, because it was very clear from the government at the time that rent control's coming in, it's on our terms, and we're not really interested in what you've got to say. It was as blunt as that. Now we're having cooperation from the government. They're asking us what we think. They are keen to listen, and we're starting to see some amendments which we would support, produced by both the government and by other MSPs. So there's a change in that direction of travel. So I think that's positive. And for somebody like myself campaigning on behalf of the private rented sector and landlords that don't win votes for politicians, I think that's a good result. So I am optimistic for the future, but we need to see delivery from the government. We need to see the minister and the cabinet actually coming up with results which support the private rented sector and not just words which our members and many others will say, yeah, it's easy to say that, but to deliver on that promise is something which is very different.
I'm sure this podcast will look at the housing bill and follow it closely as it makes its way through. I'm just turning back to the amendments that you spoke about, the landlords and that Sal would support. I wonder if you give us maybe an example of one such amendment that would have the support of the sector.
Well, there's a couple of amendments in there. One is to scrap rent control completely, so that's an amendment in there. I don't think that's going to win support, but nevertheless, it's there and will be discussed. The one that's proposed by the minister as part of our discussions is with regards to this increase of rents beyond potentially 0%. So I mentioned that earlier. Rent controls, if they came in your area, could be set at 0% increase when it comes to rents. And we said that even in a rent control area, that's not acceptable because all costs go up. Costs to landlords go up too. So there has to be a recognition of that. So how it's been amended and is yet to be approved by Parliament and indeed discussed would be that it would be set at CPI, so inflation plus 1%. So even in rent control areas, rents would still be able to go up. So the minister's proposed that. It wasn't in the bill. We welcome that, and we think that's That's a good step forward, but it's just the beginning of what we would like to see from the government in support of private landlords and letting agents.
And obviously this housing bill is going to affect the private rented sector and all Scotland's housing and the wider economy going forward for quite a long time. It is a mammoth piece of legislation for the Scottish Parliament to be handling. I'm interested if during your conversation you asked the Minister where he saw the private rented sector in the next 10 years. I'd like to turn that question around and I'd like to ask it to you directly. Where does Sal see the sector going in the next 10 years, and what can be done to make sure the future for Scottish landlords and their tenants is as fair, flexible, and most importantly, I think, given the wider economic imbalance and distortion that's going on, reliable as possible?
Well, let me make it clear. I want every landlord in Scotland to be providing the best homes that they possibly can. I think tenants deserve that. I think Scotland deserves that. We want a private rented sector that isn't just a carbon copy of a sector that exists somewhere else, that's unique to Scotland, that serves Scotland's people and delivers the housing that we want. That's what we should all be aiming towards, and I want every landlord and letting agent to be part of that journey, and I want to be part of that discussion to ensure that that happens in the future. I always say there will always be a private rented sector, so whether politicians like it or not, there will never be enough social housing in Scotland to house everybody. And likewise, not everybody will be able to afford or indeed want to be a homeowner. So we know the private rented sector is a very important part of that mix. Will it still be here 5-10 years' time? Will we still be having these discussions? Yes, we will. The issue might well be as to how it operates, how it's regulated, and importantly, who operates within it. So we might well see fewer smaller landlords in the future. I could see that happening, because if you've just got 1 or 2 properties, you might well think, well, actually, do I want to be bothered with this anymore? Your larger scale landlords, yes, they might see more of an incentive to grow their business and grow their investment here in Scotland. But at the same time, we're having discussions with institutional investors who are saying, actually, at this moment, Scotland isn't a place that we want to invest in. Now, that's not good news for the government or any politician. So they have to listen to that too. So we're going to see perhaps a different mix of landlords in Scotland in the future. We'll always have the small landlords. They might operate differently, maybe not in our city centres. Certainly institutional investors are not interested in investing all over Scotland. So there's always going to be a need for landlords and letting agents. We just need to make the decision, is that going to be us? Are we the people that are still going to be operating within it? So yes, I'm optimistic for a better private rented sector, but I want to make sure that it works to the interests of both landlords and tenants, and not forgetting that landlords are investors. They need to be encouraged, and actually we need more of them. And if we could encourage a landlord to just invest in another property, we could go far to solving Scotland's housing crisis.
Thank you, John. And with that, the first ever episode of Landlord Voice comes to an end. Be sure to keep an eye out for future episodes for more news, views, analysis and reaction on all the key topics for Scotland's private rented sector. Please do also follow the Scottish Association of Landlords on social media. You can find links to all of their feeds on scottishlandlords.com. For me, Alan Grant, and for John Blackwood, we'll see you next time. Landlord Voice is a podcast by the Scottish Association of Landlords, produced in partnership with Alan Grant Communications and Mallard Productions. All footage and music was used with permission. Questions, comments, suggestions, or other feedback should be sent to alan@alangrantcommunications.com.